I'm Brandon Vaidyanathan, and this is Beauty at Work, the podcast that seeks to expand our understanding of beauty, what it is, how it works, and why it matters for the work we do. This season of the podcast is sponsored by Templeton Religion Trust and is focused on the beauty and burdens of innovation. Hey everybody, this is part 2 of my conversation with Casper Ter Kuile and Angie Thurston of Sacred Design Lab. Please check out the first half if you haven't already. In the second half of our episode, we will dig into what they learned from their work on spiritual innovation, what allows these efforts to take root and thrive, what kinds of support spiritual innovators most need, and how mentorship and infrastructure can relieve the burdens of innovation while preserving its beauty. Let's get started. When you you obviously you're calling all these folks spiritual innovators, whether or not they embrace the term. What are the factors that are most predictive of their success, or what does success look like? I mean, in terms of spiritual innovation, and what factors contribute to whether or not an innovation gains traction?
Yeah, well, now I'm always grateful that there's two of us because, Ange, we can collectively maybe remember the 7 different things that we came up with.
Well, we could start with the 3 big buckets of
let's
needs that we've found.
Yeah,
this is very, very sort of straightforwardly, Brandon, in our last decade of working with these folks, we found they have a host of practical needs of actually being able to create and sustain new things in the world, projects of any kind. Right. They have a lot of relational needs. We spoke to the feeling of loneliness that often they would experience in their leadership because they're not quite in any one world in that way. And so there's a need for mentorship and for that, and also for peers. And then their spiritual needs. How did they go deep with the people in their care? Well, they have to be accessing that space of spiritual nourishment themselves, right? So I'd say those 3 areas for the innovators themselves, we found that successful innovation, the success of their work is often very connected to the extent to which their needs are being met in those 3 areas. And then, as Casper was beginning to allude to, we've noticed a host of qualities from what we would describe as sort of effective or successful or promising spiritual innovation. And I would say they all sort of connect to this idea. I mean, there's many words for what is the more ideal, what Charles Eisenstein would say, the more beautiful world, speaking of beauty, that our hearts know is possible. If we're trying to move toward something like that, we could use the language of flourishing or thriving, but successful spiritual innovation is helping us move toward that world, right? In ourselves, in our communities, in the larger ecosystems that we share and the societies that we're part of. So that's broadly what we were on the lookout for, is what are the conditions that lead to that kind of innovation.
Yeah. And maybe some of those specifics, just to mention, some that we were interested in, definitely one was scalability, without falling prey to, the bigger is better, but certainly we were looking for things that had the opportunity to reach a significant number of people. So, for example, we would be less interested in an individual practitioner who might offer particular, one-on-one, whether it's Reiki or healing or something, even if that was being combined in an interesting way with a different practice or an unusual context. We were mostly interested in things that could serve multiple people and hopefully at some significant scale. A project sustainability is something, having looked at this kind of question for 12 years, there have been so many awesome projects that have come and gone. A lot of individual creative, and that's normal in a kind of innovation stage, but so many wonderful projects really depended on a single individual often who right. put in the labor and the creativity and was able to make it work, but then had a baby or moved away or had a health crisis or, got a job that could pay for their health insurance or whatever it was. Yeah. We're definitely really interested in what are the models, the financial models that make these kind of projects work. And there are a host of different ones, from member sustained projects to more of a, some of them are like venture backed, for example. So, if you look at some of the big apps that most of us will be familiar with, like Insight Timer or Headspace or Hallow, time will tell how long they survive once the venture money runs out. To projects that are entirely volunteer run, like Service Space, for example, which has a huge reach. or other models that are experimenting with things like cooperatives or social enterprise model where something is revenue generating that cross subsidizes something that's then offered for free. So we've been very curious to try and understand how those different models work. That's a continuing conundrum, I would say, if not maybe always the first question, certainly one of the most significant questions we had over and over again that spiritual innovators struggle with.
Yeah. I would imagine some of these would certainly be universal in terms of the funding model, for instance, and or leadership transitions, or what sort of contributes to their ability to endure over time, and across generations, and manage their various expectations of followers, if you want to call them members, or whatever they might be called, right? The other thing I was curious about was whether you see any downsides or pitfalls or unintended consequences
Oh,
of
sure.
spiritual innovation.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. The obvious ones are often about failed leadership. Our first kind of case study that we often ended up talking about in the early years of our research was fitness communities and CrossFit especially. And so a classic example there of people being responsible for kind of soul care in a way that they were not trained for. Someone who's excellent at helping you with your form as you lift a barbell, but maybe not very skilled in navigating, your mother's cancer diagnosis. And so the most egregious examples of that would have been, inappropriate romantic relationships between someone who's in a leadership role and someone who's, a participant. But there's so many, all the things that go wrong in a congregation also go wrong in these projects. So financial mismanagement, burnout, team conflict, you name it, it happens. I think some of the more philosophically interesting examples are often about the ethics of translating a tradition. So as people are innovating, that taking a practice from one place and putting it in a new context, or as I did with the Harry Potter podcast, we were drawing on the Lectio Divina tradition, which of course itself was a spiritual innovation. Guido II, Carthusian monk of the 14th century, was adapting a different formula for engaging with a biblical text, and he put it into these 4 steps, which we now think of as, the golden approach to Lectio Divina. But that came from somewhere too. So we often quote Rabbi Owen Kulo, who says, every tradition was once an innovation. But so that question of ethic is really paramount. And so what are the reflection questions you need? What are the relationships you need? What are the kind of support and accountability structures of mentorship that are really important? And that's a lot of what we spend our time doing in terms of supporting spiritual innovators now, is trying to help them build that bench of support structures, of relationships, because we know that when they hit inevitable challenges, it's the network of support and accountability that helps people through, or where they get lost, where something comes undone. And so I would say that kind of question of leadership and ethics and translating tradition are two of the things that stand out for me.
Yeah, our colleague Sue Phillips has this beautiful phrase about the spiritual infrastructure of the future. She wrote a great article on it. And I think that's part of the predicament, is that there is, if you think about, of course, the structure, the organizational structures are different across religious traditions, but usually they do include some amount of training and formation for leadership, right? And they include also some amount of support for people once they're in positions of leadership. And that's not to mention all of the other kinds of infrastructure that exist around, if you think about just religious life, all of the elements that go into that, right? So if someone is in a position where they're spiritually innovating, what we have found is that there are pretty massive infrastructure gaps. And so all those questions Casper was just naming, whether it's about ethics and leadership, whether it's about how you sustain your work financially, or even how you make a decision about the way that you want to approach this question of money and livelihood as it relates to being called to a kind of work that has a deep spiritual core, that kind of interrogation. And then the practices and the relationships that will sustain an ongoing journey of this kind of work. We're just in a very sort of broadly transitional time when it comes to all of that. And that transition is accompanied by, of course, these additional macro forces like the rise in all of these technologies and things like that we're also having to contend with in real time. So I think there are a lot of perils to spiritual innovation in that kind of landscape. And there are real risks as far as, people just, you hope most of the time they're well-meaning, but kind of putting themselves out there and meeting people who have real needs whether or not someone else sitting over here would say that they're qualified or authorized to do that or should be doing it, right? And sometimes that can indeed lead to real harm being done. So I guess that's a big part of our hope and our project at Sacred Design Lab is to do our best, to make a contribution that will support this work being done with integrity and consideration, and also to help with the advancement of some of those elements of spiritual infrastructure, so that people are less alone in doing the work and not so much casting about, as if they're doing it for the first time, because actually there are centuries of wisdom about how to do this work well.
Right, yeah. And I imagine that's part of the challenge there is some of these innovators at least are responding to a perceived frustration with, existing traditions that they're coming out of, and they maybe even just the desire for autonomy from those traditions and wanting to perhaps the desire to chart out new territory and venture out on one's own and try to find an authentic way of engaging with some of these perennial questions, perhaps in ways that no one has done before, but are meeting our current needs right now, might make them resistant to looking to establish traditions for any help, right?
What I would say, though, Brandon, is that the resistance often is about institutions rather than individuals. And so one of the kind of lab projects that we ran a few years ago was to pair up spiritual innovators with elders, mostly ordained leaders across different traditions, for a sort of 6-month relationship building incubation experiment. And the minimum requirement was that they met for an hour each month on Zoom just to talk. And we gave, we framed this in for the elders so that they were engaging the conversations appropriately, and we gave them some questions to offer. And overwhelmingly, that was a really positive experience for both ends of the conversation. We would have an older rabbi talk with a young former Muslim, but now kind of secular yoga innovator. Or we had an older Presbyterian minister with, I'm trying to remember who it was in particular. But anyway, these kind of very unexpected conversations. And nearly always, there was such appreciation for the wisdom that came through both ways. It was energizing and exciting for the older person, and grounding and helpful to be reminded that the questions and the challenges that they were experiencing as an innovator is one that, these older folks had to navigate too, whether it was in a congregational context or something else.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to illustrate with this point is that resistance is less significant than you might expect if there is curiosity and generosity in an approach in the context of a relationship.
Yeah.
I think you're right that there's real misgivings about the power structures and everything else within institutions.
Right.
But interpersonally, it was actually much more open.
Wow. That's fascinating.
Well, and that speaks to you were asking about the burden of innovation, Brandon. And I think a burden that many of these spiritual innovators carry is the feeling that if they want something to exist, they have to create it. And that if they are creating it, they're doing so for the first time. I mean, I know it's factually untrue, but it can feel that way. And it in part because of how cut off many of these folks are from others who have done things like this. And to your point about doing it, especially outside of religious institutions, if they haven't been connected to those kinds of institutions, if they just genuinely don't necessarily know that someone in that kind of position would have wisdom that's relevant for what they're doing. And so that was part of the pilot that Casper just references. We wanted to just create conditions for them to actually meet each other and have that type of conversation to relieve some of the burden.
Yeah. No, and that sort of mentorship is critical, and just to know that someone else has done something similar, or that there is wisdom somewhere, right? That this really is, you don't really have to reinvent the wheel. But I think it's also, what I appreciate about your work too is it dispels the misconception that it's pretty pervasive that spirituality is somehow immune to the problems that are associated with traditional religion, right? It's this pure, positive, uniformly beneficial thing.
For sure. And I would say because of that, the way, whether scholars agree with this or not, the way people perceive the difference between religion and spirituality on the street is that religion is institutional and spirituality is personal. But what happens within that realm, once it's taken out of the kind of institutional context, is that spirituality and the market become very, very quickly intertwined. And so I think one of the biggest challenges on that ethics question that we were talking about before is what about money? And what can you charge for? What shouldn't be charged for? How do you make a living? But at the same time, how do you respect a tradition? And especially as some of these themes around spirituality, especially ritual, becomes more and more popular as a kind of a brand tool. I mean, literally the makeup brand rituals, right? So
Right.
you see this language kind of being co-opted by the capitalist market. Now, at the same time, does religion itself have a challenging history with, capitalism? Absolutely. So I think you're so right to point to, even though on the face of it, we might think these are very different contexts and different challenges, it's a lot of the same stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm curious to know what you're seeing in the work you're doing in relation to Gen Z. I mean, the problems that you identified in your report on how we gather were focused maybe on the millennial context, but are you seeing there's talks about a religious resurgence, a revival, or whatever you want to call it among Gen Z, to turning towards maybe more traditional forms of religion? I don't know to what extent that's borne out in data, but are you seeing that kind of, or any particular patterns among the youngest generation right now?
And I can start and I'll let you build
Sure.
build
Yeah,
in
that
more.
sounds good.
So I would say, yes, you're so right that our kind of intro framing was definitely around millennials. And so we haven't focused specifically on Gen Zs over the last couple of years. So I want to caveat everything I'm going to say next. And I think you're right to point to the difference between the narrative and the data. I think Ryan Burge's work has been very illustrative of kind of not seeing the evidence yet in the hard numbers. However, and I think here is the key thing that I find most interesting, which is that as younger generations have less of a personal experience of religious life, religious institutions, they don't have the same reaction or reactivity to institutional religion that maybe people who had a particular wounding experience did. So as people are born outside of religious tradition, rather than kind of like, oh, religion is bad, it's more just like religion is irrelevant. And then if there's something that's interesting about it, whether that's like religious iconography being used on the runway, right, in a fashion context, or the way in which like becoming really devout is somehow countercultural now, right? Like there's a different context is what I'm trying to point to for Gen Zs, in which engaging religion doesn't mean what it did for a Gen X, certainly not for a boomer context or even a millennial one. So I'm not saying that there's a religious revival per se, but what I do think is true is that younger people are very conscious that the way things are is not how they should be. And they're curious to understand whether it's a relationship with technology, for example. If you have an answer, I want it. And if you're religious or if you're secular, I'm actually pretty open to you as a source of guidance in a way that wouldn't have been the case 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, just building on that, I think I have sort of, after Casper and I moved out of Harvard Divinity School, I have stayed connected to the university, both at Harvard and now a little bit more at Columbia. And I have noticed that amongst at least the students that I've been working with, there is a sense, to Casper's point, of certainly just an assumption that things are not as they should be. And then additionally, I think a sense that educational institutions being one place that they are still finding themselves with spending a lot of time, but that those institutions also don't seem to be set up to address some of these questions either. And so, right, the questions like about meaning and purpose and belonging. And I think that I've experienced a relative openness to trying to locate sources of wisdom about those topics. And I think we see that borne out in some of the courses that are especially popular at universities across the country. At Harvard, there's one on Confucius and the Good Life, which is always massively oversubscribed. There's the one on happiness at Yale. There's like these sort of positive, and anything that's, you know what I mean? Like it's actually about, well, who am I and what does it mean for me to
Yeah.
have a good life? And why am I
Yeah.
spending my time where, these just sort of fundamental and existential questions. If one is coming of age, not having had those questions spoken to either in a religious setting or an educational setting, then, as you approach your 20s, there's just this significant vacuum, right? And I think
Yeah.
that is a perilous situation. And of course, we're seeing a lot of people, of course, turning to the people who are online to tell them about those things, right? And for better and for worse, definitely.
Yeah, yeah,
right. But
yeah,
those questions
yeah.
have not gone away. And so I would say whether it's playing out in a religious revival or it's playing out in, in terms of people finding gurus on the internet, they're going to look. People are going to look. And the question is what's going to be there to meet them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you. You're also currently catalyzing a hub for spiritual innovation or for spiritual innovators. Could you tell us a little bit about what you're doing, what you're designing to solve there, what success is going to look like for you, what you're aspiring to there?
Yeah. So after this research phase of getting to interview all these spiritual innovators around the world, we heard again and again, as Angie said, the need for relational support, practical support, and spiritual support. And so one thing we thought we could do is to create just the biggest library of resources for spiritual innovation that we could think of. So we've collected over 350 podcast episodes, books, articles, frameworks, anything, organizations, anything that might be of value. And we've organized them in a sort of choose your own adventure structure. So listeners can go to spiritualinnovation.org and pick a theme like, fund your project or questions around leadership or ethics, those challenges that we mentioned before, and find a curated kind of pathway with videos of real life stories from practitioners, some guidance with examples to point to, and then all of these resources to help hopefully meet some of the practical needs that innovators have. And then secondly, we've got a directory in which spiritual innovators around the world can create a profile, share a little bit about what they're interested in, what they know about, what they can help others with, and hopefully facilitate some of the relational needs that we know folks have. And in addition, we host regular kind of Zoom events that people can come to, which involve some teaching of a practical a tool or a framework, and then lots of breakout groups. So it helps people get to know each other.
Amazing.
And so, we'll be launching that on October 15th of this year, 2025. And we'll be keeping that going for the years to come. So please do check it out if you're interested.
Fantastic. Well, Casper and Angie, it's been phenomenal learning more about the work you're doing. If you'd like to guide our listeners to perhaps contribute, whether it's researchers, philanthropists, practitioners, what might be the most helpful thing they might do if there's something that you could direct them to? Well, we'll certainly put the links to your websites, but if there's any practical steps that you might encourage people to take in terms of growing the spiritual innovation ecosystem, what might you recommend?
I'll add one, which is, well, maybe I'll add two, if I may. One is definitely check out spiritualinnovation.org, of course, and join some of the events that we host if you're interested in just learning or understanding more. But honestly, I think the most beautiful stories to me always happen when people connect locally with an unexpected ally. So if you find yourself as a leader in a congregation or someone who's really steeped in a tradition, to go out and actively reach out to the person who runs the yoga studio or the fitness community or the arts group or the local volunteering organization that seems to be speaking to people's spiritual lives in some way, and say, hey, I love what you're doing. We kind of talk about that idea of accompaniment, of coming alongside. And I think that's really the posture that this is language we learned from our friends at Wesleyan Impact Partners, who are steeped in the Methodist tradition, but to really, without sacrificing who you are and what's important to you, to come alongside someone who's doing something new and learn from them. And then through that relationship, give what you know too, because it's in those friendships and those collaborations often that the most exciting new things emerge. So build relationships is what I would say. How about you, Ange?
Absolutely. Well, one other thing is just having referenced that platform and the resources on it, there is an invitation on the platform to add more resources. And Brandon, knowing that your listeners are there at the intersection of scholarship and practice, that is one specific intersection that we're really looking to help build out is what is the scholarly work being done about all of these changes and about spiritual innovation itself. Casper and I have had a touchstone ever since we started working together that we're out here trying to tell stories of courage and hope. We've really always been looking for where are the instances where things are coming together in a way that these spiritual longings are being met, right? So we really want to understand more about where and why that is happening. And we want to catalyze more of it, right? So for the scholars listening, we're really curious about what work should we be looking at? Should spiritual innovators be paying attention to? It could come from any number of domains. And then for the practitioners, what are the things that you draw upon in your own work? And please share those with others because we want to help strengthen what this whole ecosystem. So that's that's just a very practical invitation, but it's also one that we're going to be definitely giving our time to in the next couple of years.
Fantastic. Well, it's been really a pleasure. Thank you again for joining us and sharing your insights. And congrats on the wonderful work you're doing.
Thanks so much, you too, Brendan. Grateful to be doing it with you.
All right, folks, that's a wrap for this episode. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with someone who would find it of interest. Also, please subscribe and leave us a review if you haven't already. Thanks, and see you next time.